Welcome back to Talk Property to Me. Today we have Emily Wallace here and Aaron Downey. We're talking all things Melbourne with Emily today. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
No problems at all. So Aaron's got the questions here. So let's get straight into it. We're going to be talking about, I guess, the last part. Well, what's happened in Melbourne in the past, what's happening at the present, and what you see happening in the future. So we'll get
Yep,
straight into it.
good topic.
I think a good place to start, Emily, is probably just give us a bit of a background on yourself and what your company does. But I think for the viewers, this one's going to be really centered around Melbourne. I think it's a really hot market at the moment, so really good one to dive into at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Melbourne based and deal in the Melbourne market day in, day out.
Nice.
Being the director of a buyer's agency down here, we help a lot of first and family home buyers into the market across metro Melbourne predominantly. And, the things that they care about certainly being accessible to the city, good schools, all those good things that everybody wants in a property, right? And in a
Mhm.
location. But we do cover a fair bit of ground. So I guess my lens on the market is quite wide. And yeah, keen to unpack a bit about the Melbourne property market.
Yeah, for sure. And you are right. It's Melbourne's such a big market to cover. And I think it's a really important thing that you mentioned there with helping first home buyers, but people to move in their own property as well. I think our audience is really investment focused, and looking from that investment lens, it's just those owner occupied appeal properties that we want to try and be buying anyway. So
Yeah,
it's
it ties in
I
anyway.
think
Yeah, we're
regardless, this all of this stuff applies for investment. So
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's where the true capital gain is made, right? If you can get emotional buyers on your property bidding at auction day or putting in offers come time of sale, that's where you have the greatest uplift as an investor.
for sure.
Are you seeing most
So
most of your clients, are they first home buyers or upgraders, downgraders?
Probably about 70% would be a first time buyer, and
Yep.
then the other 30% split between downsizers and upsizers. And for first home buyers, it's their first home, but they also do want to make sure they're buying something that will springboard them into the next property. So there is an element of, I guess, investment lens there, but the primary driver is around facilitating their lifestyle and having some key tick boxes in their first home.
Yep. Perfect. So capital growth trends over the last 10, 20 years, how have you seen it sort of tracking Melbourne, I guess, in the last 20 years? What's the general capital growth doing now?
Good question. I can't say that I've been in real estate for 20 years because that would mean that I'd be extremely, I'd be close to a newborn. But in terms of, look, Melbourne being, particularly Metro Melbourne being one of the most sought after places to be living in, and for a long time there was deemed one of the most livable cities in the world. The only direction in which the market has gone is upwards. Yes, it's had bumps along the way, but if you look at a 20-year time span, the capital growth has been crazy in some areas. It's been nuts, but also it's property specific too. Houses obviously perform better than units, and there's blue chip areas versus those sort of hot spots and not spots. But generally speaking, the market has been in an upwards direction.
yeah, and I mean we've got some key stats here, and that's the thing with the more micro markets that you operate in. A lot of the data that is obviously put out there in the media is more macro data, just based on the whole Melbourne market. And Melbourne has been a contracting market for the last sort of 5 years as a whole, but it's actually been the best performing market over a 40-year time horizon. And typical, like the typical last macro cycle went for about 20 years, which is crazy from a growth perspective. I think some of the really key stats over the past sort of 2 years, particularly, has been the population growth. Uh, we've had 400,000 roughly in the financial year 23, and 182,000 of them were for people in Melbourne or Victoria.
Mm-hmm.
So, from looking from purely a supply and demand side of things, population growth is not only present at the moment, but forecast to continue.
Yeah, for sure. And it's that desirability of Melbourne, right? Like, yes, unfortunately, it got slammed a fair bit in 2020, 2021. It was definitely a lot of people fleeing and going to interstate and sea change, tree change for locals. But in terms of people migrating or even just from interstate looking at Melbourne, I've had so much inquiry from Brisbane and Sydney residents wanting
Mm.
to come to Melbourne because they feel it's more affordable, more attainable, and has more to offer. And I think, being the sporting capital of Australia, there's a lot to be said for that. There's always something happening in Melbourne. Like every night, there's something going on.
Mm.
It's not for everybody. Don't get me wrong. Like, some people might like a regional centre that is a bit quieter and a bit more condensed in terms of community. But certainly, Melbourne has a lot going for it in an array of different avenues.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned that before with one of the most livable cities in the world. I think one of the big things that you just mentioned there is the affordability piece and interest from Sydney and Brisbane buyers.
Mhm.
Brad and I talk a lot about affordability with home buyers generally and investors particularly. And I was reading there before that Sydney commands a 40% premium to Melbourne. So, the economic times that we're in at the moment, you can see why people would have that interest to migrate south.
Absolutely. I went to Sydney just last month, and obviously being the property nerd that I am, brought up the map and had a look at the sales in the area and the rentals. I was like, oh my gosh, I couldn't actually live here. This doesn't make sense to live here because the cost of a mortgage or even just the cost of monthly rent, like this is nuts. Like I love Sydney, but I don't love it that much,
Yeah.
And that's not to diss Sydney. Like I think it's a beautiful place, but unless you've been there a while and you got in at a certain point in time, I think it's unattainable for a lot of people. And so hence why we're getting a lot of these greenfields estates further out that are more achievable, and these little satellite communities that are being created because housing near the CBD is just, yeah, it's out of reach for a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. And Brad, we spoke about that recently, didn't we? Didn't we uh, with that lifestyle factors and the key demographics with buying them? You've got a lot of millennials getting into the market now, and they're choosing lifestyle over other things, which then changes the land component or the house size that they're necessarily buying.
We're personally seeing that the sweet spot for a first home buyer at the moment is sort of around that 800, 900K. So good luck getting something like that in Sydney. You just can't.
Mm.
Is there much
I
in
don't
the?
even think it's a one bedroom in Bondi, right?
It
Like
isn't.
it's
Seriously, it
nothing.
isn't. Is there much in the Melbourne area still at that price point? Sort of that sub.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's like we've just started working with a buyer last week with a 900K budget. They're looking for a 2+ study townhouse in Pascoe, which is about 13 Ks out of the CBD off the top of my head. Good arterials in, it's near the airport as well, but it has a lot going for it, and that is attainable. One of maybe 3 or 4 on the block in terms of townhouse, or maybe an older style villa unit that they could add some value to, that will give them a bit of longevity. It absolutely is doable. And then closer in, it's probably more of a 2-bedroom, oversized, older style apartment. But apartments offer lifestyle, and they are what a lot of first home buyers are purchasing. I know that there's a strong stance on investments. Apartments as investments are maybe not the best way to spend your money, but in terms of first home buyers, that's what they're buying.
Yeah. It really, with apartments, my opinion is it really depends where you're buying.
Hmm.
It's the location,
Yeah.
not the asset itself. So the sorry, one bedroom apartment, as you said, in Bondi is worth an absolute shitload compared to a 1 bedroom apartment in Campbelltown in Sydney. It's the location, it's the demand for that in that area, and first home buyers would prefer the lifestyle, and we see that in Newcastle as well.
For sure. It's first and foremost, and the idea of having a big house with a big yard and stuff just doesn't seem to be everyone's dream these days. It seems a bit of a pastime in a way.
Yeah, I think my first home was a townhouse and then an apartment and then a house because I
Yeah.
had no need for the yard. Like literally, I was walking distance to pubs. That was more important.
Yeah, it's just, and lawns are just something you have to maintain or pay for someone to maintain
I
most
still
of the
don't like
time. Like
doing
I
that.
would rather, yeah, a paved courtyard all the way.
Yeah.
Yep,
Is
AstroTurf.
that what you're seeing at the moment, Emily, with that Melbourne market, or particularly the clients that you look after, they're choosing to purchase and just get into the market as opposed to rent vesting or doing something else?
Look, it's a really interesting one. I always ask the question when I have a call with someone like, have you considered rent vesting? Because if they're really like the questions they're asking are really investment focused, but it is a first home, I'm like, maybe you shouldn't be buying your first home
Mm.
because usually they don't typically coexist. And so, particularly in Melbourne. So I think probably 3 or 4 years ago, the conversation went that people did want to rent vest and they were big on that. More recently, I'm getting a lot of people saying, well, I just need the security of knowing where I'm going to live. I'm sick of my rent increasing. I'm sick of having to move every 12 months because the landlord wants to sell. And I just want to plant my feet somewhere I know that it's mine.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I think there is sort of this idea of paying for security, which for some people they absolutely need. That's just part of who they are and their risk profile. But the ones who are probably a bit more, I guess, adaptable to change have gone down the rent vesting avenue. But I would say it's not a majority by any means.
Yeah, for sure.
I personally got
And
I got over property managers. I couldn't stand it anymore. Like, I know there's a lot of noise around at the moment. You shouldn't have an owner occupied and all these things. No, I think you need an owner occupied just for stability. You determine how long you stay there for, not someone else. If you've got kids, you've got a family, you need that stability.
Yeah, for sure. Even personally, I'm at a crossroads with that at the moment because I am a rent-vestor, but
Yep.
I'm wanting to get out of the rental that I'm currently in due to a very bad neighbor, unfortunately. And I'm glad I didn't buy there because if I found out that was my neighbor, I'd be very upset. But that being said, I'm at this crossroads of like, do I buy? Do I go another 12 months renting? Like, what am I prepared to put up with, and how much stability do I need? I think a lot when you have dependents come into the mix. I think a lot around school zones and schooling and creating a stable foundation for children is really, really important. And I can see that happen with our clients. That's kind of sometimes their decision making to buy a property to call their own. But yeah, when you do have an investment hat on, it's hard to, sort of not think about the rent investing avenue because it can make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. And it's obviously a question, a conversation we have with all of our clients, and it's establishing goals first and foremost to work out what their risk profile is and what their values are, to determine what the property outcome will be.
Yeah, I think it's such an important conversation to have, right? Because starting with, like, a lot of people are like, oh, I saw this property, it looks like it'd be a great investment. And that's not the starting point. Like, it baffles me how many people go in with that. It's like, whoa, hang on, what's your plan? And does that actually fit into the plan? And like, let's just take a step back. Like, what do you actually want to achieve? And it seems so logical, particularly for all three of us being in the property and finance
Mm.
world. Like, that's where you would start with a plan. What are your goals? How does that translate to what you want to achieve? And what property do you need to get you there in terms of a vehicle for wealth? But so many first-time investors or just misinformed investors go with the property first and then figure
Probably
out the plan, and that's not really how it should be done.
if you're buying
Mm.
properties at a seminar, that's how they start too. This is our off the plan purchase. No matter what your goals are, this is the one for you.
The worst
Yes.
kind.
we don't deal with them, and we wouldn't get any of them on the show. So
No.
you mentioned you did mention that bad neighbours, that does make a huge difference. It really does. How do you have any tips on how to sort of manage that when you would be looking for a property for a client? Do you knock on the
Yeah.
doors and interview them, or what's the?
It's a great question. Look, ultimately, if you could speak to the neighbours before you become their neighbour, I think that would be like the pinnacle of finding out information. And so a lot of neighbours do attend open homes. And if you overhear someone saying, oh, I just live next door, I want to see what this one looked like grab that person and talk to them for sure.
Yep.
But outside of that, if it's particularly in apartments, if it's a bigger complex, like I would go to the local Facebook group and say, like, I'm thinking about buying into an apartment at XYZ address. Does anyone have any intel? And people love a bit of gossip in suburbs. Like they love throwing in their 2 cents.
I'm in my local one, and it's flooded. Like literally, I've had to mute it. It's very, very vocal.
Yeah, so but that's the best thing as a buyer because you can assess, like there might be someone who has lived in that building who knows like if there is a bad neighbor in there or what the vibe might be, if there's too many Airbnbs in the block or, things like that. So as much information as you can gather to make a good decision on a neighbor, particularly when you're buying, is a really, really important step and one that I've somewhat learnt the hard way.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
all
I
have.
think for the listeners, there's probably two things on top of what Emily said. Talking to the neighbours is the best thing that you can do, and Facebook groups. You've obviously got that local knowledge. There are tools out there like rent, like obviously a higher proportion of owners compared to renters are important. But tools like microverbs, like they've got really micro data, street level data for crime and stuff like that. So if you can't speak to the neighbours or get any information from these forums, tools like microverbs is a great little tool for people buying as well.
For sure. Go in with the facts and understand exactly like what it is that you're getting yourself into. Knowledge is
For sure.
power, particularly with property. It's crazy how much you kind of need to know.
Yeah. Yeah. There's one particular thing that I'm interested in. Obviously, there's multiple markets in Melbourne, and we're all aware of that. But looking from Victoria from a really macro lens, Victoria's forecast population growth is set to exceed every other state in Australia over the next couple of decades.
Yeah.
I've been reading a little bit about the supply as well. There is a little bit of supply coming. There certainly wasn't in 2024. There's a few activity zones within Melbourne which will increase supply, but it still doesn't look like supply is going to increase with that population demand.
hmm Yeah, I think we do have a real supply issue, but not in the right types of properties. The problem is, I think there is an oversupply in like new build apartments that were poorly designed, that are shoe boxes and no one really wants to live in, high body corporate fees with a gym and pool that they'll never use. The things that we're missing are like those medium density properties. The townhouses, double story townhouse complexes are just like perfect 3 bed, 2 bath, garage, and a small courtyard near parklands. Like we need more of those. And the difficulty with those types of builds and I guess area to even build in is the land is so expensive.
Yeah.
Like it's just nuts and you just can't make it feasible. Like in terms of a developer buying in the land, then they're trying to cram more in because they need to make their profit, or at least just break even in some cases. And so yeah, I think we have an undersupply of the right types of property,
Mm.
and we've got too many of these sort of crappy apartments that no one really wants to touch. But then it's funny, and I've had this conversation a few times with people in the property space, like in Australia, we really value space. But if
Mm.
you go to the extreme, think about India, for example, like the amount of people living in a dwelling and a small dwelling, they make it work. And it is
Mhm.
like, our 2 bedroom apartments would be massive to someone who's been in a 1 bedroom that basically sleeps 6 people.
Yeah.
So it's what we're accustomed to. It's a cultural thing. And apartments are becoming more of our culture. But generally speaking, you won't see many families living in an apartment. In the major capital cities, this is just not what they go for.
Yeah.
So I do wonder if we need a bit of a cultural shift to potentially um, actually maximize what supply we do have and make
Mm.
that work, because it's a lot more feasible with infrastructure and what already exists to have um, high rise than
Mm.
to have an urban sprawl.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Government can try and incentivize these developments to go forward, but they need to be feasible for the developer.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just not going to happen.
Exactly. And, I think there's a lot of developers throwing their hands up in the air and going, this is just too hard. So
Yeah,
they're changing course or they're
yeah,
getting out of, property, which fair enough. I totally get it. But we need you. So if you're a developer listening, like we
yeah,
do need
exactly.
you. Don't
Yeah,
go anywhere.
Keep building.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I think what I want to touch on now is particular markets within Melbourne.
Mm,
So there's and I'm heavily involved in the investment space. There's a lot of talk online now, especially around areas like Golden Square and Melton, from an investment perspective,
yep.
and obviously forecast growth, population growth. But from your understanding of that whole Melbourne market, or even regional Victoria, where would you say a good market is for the next sort of 12 months, but then for the next decade for different price points?
Yeah, it's a great question. The Melton area, I actually personally own an investment out there, and it's done extremely well over time. I bought it 7 years ago, so you can only imagine what the
Nice.
growth's been like since. And
Yeah.
I literally stumbled across it. As I said, like I'm not an investment advocate, but I like research and that sort of thing in my own time. And that's certainly, in my opinion, still a good entry level investment area. Um,
Yeah.
but in terms of, I guess, speaking to the markets that I deal with quite heavily, which is closer to the city, the most underrated stock type, in my opinion, are unrenovated villa units. So they're single level dwellings. There's usually 4 to 6 on a block, and they tick a lot of boxes. And the resale of them would be to first home buyers.
Mhm.
So places like Mentone, Cheltenham, Hyatt in sort of the Bayside Southeast corridor, Murrumbina, Hughesdale, Oakley in the true southeast or inner southeast pocket is a
Mhm.
great opportunity there for villa units. And then Pascoe Oak Park, and Glenroy on the northwest side. I think there's certainly, I wouldn't say there's oversupply of them, like they are hard to find. You probably need to network with agents to get your hands on them, but 2 bedroom, 1 bath, 1 garage, unrenovated villa unit with a facelift reno, manufacturing some equity, but also buying into a location that is somewhere that people want to live.
Mm.
I think if your investment budget was between 6 to 700K, like I do think you could do well out of that. The regional markets I can't speak to because I don't deal in them. I'm
Mhm.
sure you could get a house on land for that price out there.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's what it looks like. Maybe two. Who knows?
Yeah.
But in terms of inner metro Melbourne, I think that's where there's a bit of opportunity for investors.
I think that whole manufacturing equity is just an opportunity across the board.
Mm,
Like there's so many strata titled buildings across Sydney, across Newcastle, across Brisbane, and people just don't want unrenovated products. And if somebody has the capital and has the ability to go in there and do the work themselves, standard 6, 7, 8%, they can turn that into 10 to 12% annual returns
yeah,
by just doing a small cosmetic facelift.
yeah, for sure. And they're not difficult to do. It's just you got to know a couple of things.
Yeah,
But they're not hard to have maximum impact for minimal costs. And I don't mean like do a cheap reno. I just mean maximize the return of what dollars you do put into the renovation.
for sure.
Yeah, kitchens, bathrooms, flooring. They're the they're the main
Yeah,
things people look at.
Yeah,
yeah, 100%. A big impact and can make a world of difference. Even I've seen properties, before they go on market, before an express reno, and then seen the uplift and the result of what the vendor has been able to get, in that situation. And it's crazy, like 100K at times, which is big uplift.
yeah.
First
And
home,
it's just,
if first home buyers struggle to save up their 5% as it is. They don't want
Yes.
to be buying something that then they're going to have to save up another 100 grand or borrow against. And under the first home loan deposit scheme, they're maxed out at 95. They can't borrow more. So that's
mm,
why they're looking for places that have decent facilities already.
For sure. It's probably the most common request I get. Move in ready, not a
Yep.
thing to do. I'm spending money in this place. I don't want to have to think about a renovation.
Yeah. Yeah. We see that a lot.
again, I think that's across the board. Like if you're dealing with families and even downsizers, that opportunity's there. Downsizers don't want to buy and do any renovation work. They want something move-in ready.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an untapped market, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thanks for jumping
And
on
in
today.
terms,
Oh, no. We've
well,
got one
yeah,
more.
in terms of Emily Wallace and Wallace Advocates, what's to come for the new year and the next 5 years?
Great question. I wish I knew the exact answer, but in the short term, it's definitely we're growing the team a little bit, just a little
Okay.
bit. I don't want to grow too big, and really focusing on just even niching down even further into the markets that we service.
Yeah.
So that's a real focus for us. And then I think on a industry level, helping to I guess impact the benchmark of standards of what people can expect from a buyer's advocate.
Yeah.
There's a lot of new advocates coming into the space, which is great. Like it's awesome to see that there's a need for us in the buying journey, but it's very unregulated and there's no best practice in place. So hopefully influencing that to a degree of, being somewhat of a benchmark of what clients could expect from working with a BA and keeping everyone happy.
Yeah, for sure. Transparency is needed across the board in real estate, I think.
We see it all
Yeah,
the time.
yeah, I can
Seminars.
imagine.
Come to
Yeah,
my
the seminars
seminar.
have got to stop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They got to stop.
Yeah, they've been around. I've been doing this for 10 years now, and yeah, they've been around for as long as I've been around, and well before that. You can go to
Yeah.
Yeah.
you can go to a seminar and you'll meet the buyer's agent. He's also a mortgage broker. He's also an accountant and a financial planner. You don't have to go anywhere. Good to go. But where's the
I
best
think
place?
it's definitely improving.
Where's the best
For sure.
place for people to reach out to you, Emily, if they've got any direct questions?
Oh, for sure. I'm very active on socials, so Instagram, TikTok, or you can shoot me an email. My email address is on our website, Wallace Advocates.
Yep.
Yeah, happy to help if I can.
Perfect. And I'll throw those links up in the show notes for today's podcast as well.
Perfect. Sounds fab.
No worries. Thanks for jumping
Awesome.
on today.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great chat.
Thanks.
Thanks, Emily.